Hello, good evening. Welcome to Novara Live. My name is Bastani. Tonight I have the immeasurable pleasure, the insurpassable pleasure of being joined by Kieran and Andrieu. Kieran, how are we?
Aaron, I'm well, thank you. Still here in my solitary confinement with the additional coat stand and Palestinian flag. So doing better. How are you, Aaron?
I'm doing okay, Kieran. I could be worse. We do have a tremendous show ready for tonight. Talks on the second phase of the Gaza Ceasefire are set to begin. 2 Israeli citizens have been shot in the US by gunmen who mistook them for Palestinians. The ARC conference is underway in London, fronted by a who's who of the transatlantic reactionary right. And we'll discuss whether Rachel Reeves is a compulsive liar. Today, Russian and US officials met in Saudi Arabia for Ukraine peace talks, and Ukraine was not invited. Other European states have also been left out in the cold. Present in Riyadh are US Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and National Security Advisor Mike Waltz. You can see they're sat on the left in that video. On the right, meanwhile, representing Russia is Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and his Chief Foreign Policy Advisor Yuri Ushakov. The Saudi hosts were present for welcoming statements and then left both parties, the Russians and the Americans, to effectively get on with it. Before the talks began, BBC correspondent Tom Bateman shouted 2 questions to Marco Rubio. Is the US sidelining Ukraine, and what concessions will be asked of Russia? He received no answer to either question. After the meeting, which lasted for almost 5 hours, Rubio told reporters the delegations had agreed to explore closer relations and economic cooperation between their respective countries. That is a huge shift away from the Biden administration's efforts to isolate the Russian Federation. He also said they'd agreed to create a higher-level team to support Ukraine peace talks. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky was in Turkey for the inauguration of a new Ukrainian embassy building. He told reporters this at the opening ceremony. As a country, we want peace. We want the war to end. However, we want the end of this war to be based on certain security guarantees. We expect these security guarantees to be provided by the US, the EU, Turkey, and all of Europe. We will never, under any circumstances, recognize our temporarily occupied territories as part of Russia. They are part of Ukraine. Zelensky also reiterated Ukraine's commitment to diplomacy and called on all mediators, including Russian, American, and European actors, to engage in meaningful dialogue. This morning, the Kremlin issued the following statement in response. Putin himself said that he would be ready to negotiate with Zelensky if necessary, but the legal basis of agreements needs to be discussed considering the reality that Zelensky's legitimacy can be questioned. Putin has repeatedly questioned the legitimacy of Volodymyr Zelensky, whose presidential term expired last May. Ukrainian officials say the continuing Russian invasion and the necessary imposition of martial law as a result make it impossible to hold an election in Ukraine. And as we reported yesterday, Starmer met in Paris with other European leaders for an informed discussion of the situation and how to deal with the US's more antagonistic approach to the continent under Trump. Today, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen met with US Special Envoy for Ukraine, Keith Kellogg. Here's a section from the readout of that meeting. President von der Leyen stressed that the EU is carrying its full share of military assistance to Ukraine and stands ready to do even more. Reaffirming the EU's commitment to a just and lasting peace, the President reiterated that any resolution must respect Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity, backed by strong security guarantees. She also expressed the EU's willingness to work alongside the US to end the bloodshed and help secure the just and lasting peace that Ukraine and its people rightfully deserve. As the President made it clear, now is a critical moment. European Commission spokespeople dodged questions about what was said behind closed doors, including on whether there were any guarantees Europe would eventually get a seat at the table. The Guardian newspaper reports that the current line seems to be there can be no just and lasting peace with Ukraine without Ukraine, and there can be no just and lasting peace with Ukraine without the EU. Obviously, of course, a just peace is not the only way this could end. Kieran, what happens now? Do you think that a deal between the Americans and Russia can work if it excludes one of the parties, Ukraine, and excludes the Europeans, of course, given that this is their neighbourhood?
Well, my expectation is that they will do a deal and that it will eventually and retroactively, begrudgingly accepted by Ukraine and the EU. Obviously, I don't know what the terms of that will be, but I anticipate strongly that a deal will be done, and that it will be retroactively ratified by all parties, even if it crosses some of their red lines. And I think that quite simply because I think that Ukraine and the European Union will accept that quite simply because of the enormous power disparity between the US and Russia on the one hand, and the EU and Ukraine on the other. I mean, Zelensky was right today when he said nobody is winning this war on the battlefield, right? Nobody is winning on the battlefield. And that stalemate, if we can call it that, has emerged despite and partly because of hundreds of billions of dollars, pounds, and euros being spent by the West to prop up Ukraine. I mean, the numbers are staggering. Over $180 billion have been spent by the US in Ukraine since the beginning of the war. Over 13 billion euros have been spent across the European Union since the beginning of the war. And in the UK alone, 13 billion pounds have been spent to essentially prop up Ukraine through the war. Now, that money was spent presumably because the West, under the auspices of NATO, felt that it was money well spent to contain the threat of an expansionist Russia. Now, we can argue about the dangers of an expansionist Russia. We can argue about the dark heart of Vladimir Putin. And by the way, I think it's a very dark heart indeed. But what we can't do is deny that this money has done anything other than prolong a dreadful war and driven up the human cost dreadfully as a result. So I'm going to say something maybe a bit controversial, maybe not far enough for some people. I hate Donald Trump. This is not the controversial bit, by the way. I hate Donald Trump. I hate everything he stands for. I hate Vladimir Putin. I think he's a war criminal. But regardless of that, it is a good thing that discussions are being held and will be taken seriously. Again, I don't know what fruit, if any, they're going to yield at this stage. And I would hate to see Ukrainians have land taken away from them. But I hate even more a grinding forever war with no viable route out, because, perpetuated by Western governments like Keir Starmer's, because they're too afraid in many cases to face their own domestic electorates without the glamour of military fatigues.
Yeah, the number you gave with regards to the UK, 13 billion. That's since 2022, by the way. I think this absolute specific number since 2022 is 12.8 billion. Then, of course, there's money before that. So it's more than 13 billion in all. 12.8 billion since 2022 is just extraordinary. And these are the kinds of numbers which are just sort of bandied around by politicians as if they don't matter. Of course, not long ago, we saw Keir Starmer give that bizarre press conference statement where he said that the UK would be giving Ukraine £3 billion a year for a century. I mean, you don't need to worry about 100 years. Try 100 days. That's a lot of money, 3 billion a year for a century. 13 billion since 2022. I live in a medium-sized city in this country. I live in Portsmouth. I'm from Bournemouth. If you gave 100 million to Portsmouth, right? Now, I don't trust the council to do this, but let's say you could wave a magic wand and do the things that are worth spending the money on. Upgrade 3 or 4 train stations, redo the city centre, upgrade a couple of parks, maybe have some, municipally owned buildings that can be given over to certain businesses, certain enterprises, social enterprises, blah, 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 blah. By the way, 100 million's a lot of money. This stuff is like single-figure millions. You could make those places sensational. Sensational places to live, to work, to visit. 100 million. We've given 13 billion to Ukraine in 2 years. That's 130 towns and cities that could be so much better. The lives of tens of millions of people in this country would be so much better. But, to the political class, 13 billion, well, it means I get to go and give it the big one at some global defense conference in Munich or in the US or God knows where, Riyadh, God knows where. And I get to look like a big shot. Money well spent. Money well spent. And actually, you look at what could really make a huge change in this country, make a huge difference. Another great example, we didn't give AstraZeneca, I believe it was, or maybe it was Glaxo. It was a major pharmaceutical company. We disagreed in terms of tens of millions about whether or not they were going to base a vaccine production plant here in the UK. An urgent matter of national security if there's another pandemic. But we give 13 billion to Ukraine. And I really can't say this enough. You're right to be angry. If you walk down your high street, there's weeds growing out there, looks like crap, rubbish isn't being collected, the roads look like crap, massive antisocial behavior, nothing works, you can't get proper treatment in the NHS, and then you see 13 billion going somewhere. And it's not, and people say, well, 13 billion, it stopped Putin. No, it didn't. There's now a set of negotiations where Ukraine isn't even involved. Donald Trump is saying he wants Ukraine to give them $500 billion US. So basically, they lost a couple of 100,000 people. We gave them 13 billion. The US gave them what? More than $100 billion US. So they could literally be in a worse situation today than 2 years ago. Is that money well spent? Seriously? That's what the political class, by the way, the people responsible for those decisions, Boris Johnson and more recently Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak, they need to be able to say with a straight face, that was money well spent. I don't think any person being remotely serious thinks that for one moment. Ukraine is losing the war. The sooner it stops, the more land they keep and fewer people die. Why would anyone be against this? Kieran, I mean, that's a pretty good formulation, isn't it? I mean, what's your view on that? It basically seems to me, because the steel man here is, they'd say, Aaron, Kieran, from the first story with Ukraine, yes, we gave them 13 billion, but it means that, I don't know what it means, because we didn't save anybody's life. Hundreds of thousands of people have died since. We're having peace negotiations anyway, which, by the way, don't even include Ukraine. And now Donald Trump is trying to extort $500 billion off the Ukrainians. So we basically gave them 13 billion to be in a worse situation. Am I being unfair?
No, I don't think you're being unfair. Look, I consider what's happened to Ukraine, I'm sure you do as well, Aaron, appalling, an abomination. And of course, Ukraine has the right to defend itself. It has a right to its sovereign territory. And, that is extremely important. I do, however, think that, unfortunately, clearly, just to go over what we said initially and in response to the point you read out, flooding Ukraine with weapons and money and, as it turns out, false hope, dreams, unrealizable dreams, has massively prolonged this war and has led to a high death toll. Does that mean that Russia, under Putin, expansionist ideas about its future should be given a blank check? Obviously not. But this kind of, I don't want to straw man, but this kind of Paul Mason view that, if you observe the realities of the situation, if you look at it through a kind of a more realistic lens with a view to immediately stopping or dramatically cutting the death toll on both sides, that you are somehow a Putin apologist or capitulating to the Kremlin, etc., etc., I think has been immensely unhelpful. And, if you take the view as I do, and I'm sure some of the listeners and viewers will, some may not. Some may think that I am a Putin apologist by saying this. I can assure them I'm really not. But if you broadly take the view that some governments in the West, in Europe, have used Ukraine to bolster their own personal popularity at home, then really what you're dealing with is a very disgusting situation. Even if you are committed to, and I'm sure there are, people who are really committed to Ukrainian independence, who really are repulsed at what Russia has done, that's totally legitimate. And they really support finding as just a solution for Ukrainians as possible. To know that some politicians have been bandwagoning on this extremely serious issue with many, many bodies piled up off the back of it, knowing that they've been bandwagoning off the back of it to bolster their own electoral chances domestically, must make everybody sick. I mean, Boris Johnson found redemption in Ukraine. You know, the guy was defenestrated at home. Anybody else's political career would be in ruins forever. And to an extent, actually, I don't think he's come back in the way he expected to be able to. But if he's found redemption anywhere, it's in Ukraine. It's in being the greatest friend to Zelensky and to the Ukrainians. Keir Starmer is, in my opinion, and I'm happy to be challenged on this, I think it's quite clear that Keir Starmer is doing that while still in power. He's trying to find redemption while still in power using Boris Johnson's blueprint, Ukraine. And it doesn't please me to say this. I'm not gleeful about it. I would much rather not a single drop of Ukrainian or Russian blood have been spilt since the beginning of the war, really. That's probably what distinguishes me from the likes of Paul Mason. But yeah, I think, be a bit more discerning. Some people need to be a bit more discerning about why Keir Starmer and why Europe's politicians are so fanatically pouring money or have poured money into Ukraine.
Israel has announced that negotiations on the second phase of the Gaza ceasefire deal will begin this week. The talks were originally supposed to start on the 3rd of February. Relatedly, Hamas has said that 6 more hostages will be released next Saturday and 4 dead bodies will be handed over on Thursday. They say they've agreed to this because they want to see the second stage of the ceasefire happen. Mediators hope that during this second phase, Hamas will agree to release all remaining hostages, and Israel will commit to a full withdrawal of troops from Gaza. Here's Israeli Foreign Minister Gideon Saar addressing journalists.
We will begin negotiations on second phase of the hostage deal. Israel is committed to our goal to ensure the release of all our hostages. We also committed to all the objectives of the war as were decided by the Security Cabinet. We demand complete demilitarization of Gaza. We will not accept the continued presence of Hamas or any other terrorist groups in Gaza.
Most experts do not consider the eradication of Hamas a realistic demand, adding to concerns about whether the ceasefire can or will hold. How would that work, by the way? Official. Hamas is now over. Would this be a tweet from Benjamin Netanyahu or something? The Israeli Prime Minister has, however, been very clear about his own ambitions for the future of Gaza. He's fully on board with Trump's plan to take over and build a different Gaza after facilitating the, quote, departure of Palestinians from their own land. That's another name for ethnic cleansing via forced displacement, followed by illegal annexation. Trump has previously spoken about turning Gaza into, quote, the Riviera of the Middle East, and even suggested it could be better than Monaco. And more recently, he said Palestinians have, quote, no alternative but to leave because of the destruction Israel's genocidal war has caused. You can see the scale of that destruction in this drone footage from January. According to an estimate by the UN Satellite Center, around 66% of all buildings in Gaza have been destroyed or damaged. Alon Liel, former Director General of Israel's Foreign Ministry, told Al Jazeera that the Arab world and wider international community must present an alternative plan. As long as you don't have an alternative plan, and the only plan is Trump's, it is helping the government of Israel to act accordingly. Opposition to the Trump plan is not enough in words. You have to agree on an alternative and back it in a way that you have the logistics and financing. I mean, this is crazy, right? You need a plan with the logistics and the financing. Israel spent 2 years destroying, pulverizing somewhere. 66% of all the buildings are damaged or destroyed. But now you guys, in Britain, you guys have a problem with that? You need to come up with the financing. Maybe your taxpayers can pay for the stuff to be rebuilt so then we can destroy it again in 25 years' time. An Arab League meeting on Gaza, which was called in response to Trump's ethnic cleansing proposal and initially scheduled for next week, has been postponed until the 4th of March. The Egyptian Foreign Ministry said the new date was agreed as part of, quote, substantive and logistical preparations for the summit. For now, the Stage 1 ceasefire agreement remains officially in place. Officially. Despite this, though, Israel continues to kill civilians in Gaza. Al Jazeera reports that this morning the Israeli military shot dead a woman in Rafah. Israeli forces also killed a child near Al-Wada Square, also in Rafah. According to the Palestinian Information Center, the agency says another child was shot and injured east of Gaza's city, Shujaa neighborhood. Last week, Director General of the Gaza Ministry of Health, Munir al-Bush, said that Israeli attacks, unexploded ordnance, and fatal injuries sustained earlier in the conflict had killed 118 people since the ceasefire agreement itself had taken place. Ministry of Health figures do not include deaths from indirect causes, such as diseases spread due to Israeli destruction of infrastructure and restrictions on humanitarian aid. Mentioning that matters because Gaza City is, right now, facing a health and environmental disaster due to a massive accumulation of waste in its streets and public areas. Israeli forces destroyed 133 of the municipality's waste collection trucks, amounting to around 80% of its operational fleet. So it's now feared that makeshift dump sites in the city could become hotspots for disease epidemics. Kieran, this is something we saw in the Yemen war a few years ago with Saudi Arabia. For all the military prowess of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia's Air Force, primarily UK and US fighter jets, what actually killed many more people was precisely these kinds of outbreaks, right? Cholera, I remember being a big one. More than 1 million cases of cholera in Yemen during the Saudi-Yemen war. Is this now the next big threat confronting the people of Gaza, given there is something of a cessation of hostilities? Not completely, but something of a cessation.
I think it's probably the primary one as things stand, but there are, of course, two or multiple threats, but at least two major threats. One, as you say, is the disease and so on, starvation that results from the utter obliteration of the conditions that make human life possible. The other is, of course, a resumption in more direct military attacks and so on from Israel. And I have spoken to friends who have family in Gaza over the past week, and they are constantly on high alert for the latter, and of course, constantly fearful about the former. And, you know, it's kind of thing is going to develop quite rapidly if Israel and the United States continue to gatekeep Gaza as they have done for many, many, many years, but in the condition it's in now, which is to say, shifting the discourse as well about what is and isn't acceptable around treaty making or ceasefires. I mean, I'm unclear, though I don't think there has ever been an example, but I'm unclear if there's ever been an example where treaty is written by highest bidder, which is kind of the quotations that you read a moment ago, Aaron. That's kind of where it leads us. So, you know, you have to go and put together, a business plan, a business operations brief, you know, to justify the existence of any semblance of Palestinian state in Gaza or any semblance of a Gazan population inside Gaza. In other words, shifting the burden of proof for existence, very existence, onto Palestinians. So, yeah, starvation, disease, they are very, very serious threats inside Gaza right now. Also, the resumption of military attacks, very, very serious threat. And of course, around that is the discursive reshaping of what is expected of a beleaguered party, a genocided party in this case, in presenting its case for very existence.
Do you think there's a conscious effort, perhaps, by elements within the Israeli regime to kind of let this play out? I mean, the paradigmatic example of pathogens running wild during a genocide, of course, is, you know, the best part of half a millennium ago with the Americas and the conquistadors. I'm not suggesting that was intentional. It wasn't. But we know that disease, viruses, even sometimes pandemics, can go hand in hand with war. And of course, people in the IDF, senior figures in the Israeli political class, they're not stupid. They know that. They want as many people to leave Gaza as humanly possible. Do you think this might start to figure in a kind of conscious political strategy, in so much as it does feel hard to believe? I know we said 66% of all buildings have been damaged or destroyed, but for 80% of the refuse trucks to now have been destroyed, I mean, that kind of feels like it might be an intentional strategy.
Well, I would go a little further out than you, Aaron, and say that it has been from the start. At least some elements within the Israeli political class have been hoping that such a thing will advance on the people of Gaza. I have no doubt about that whatsoever, and I think it would take an extremely magnanimous reading to ignore that, given the kind of genocidal pronouncements that many in the Israeli political class have said, and of course we've quoted them many times on this show. Let's not forget that it was that genocide, though it was coined as a legal term after World War II, immediately after World War II, I think, or perhaps during World War II, it grew out of a kind of scientific racism. Well, that's the wrong thing to say, actually. Of course, genocide predated scientific racism, but the two coalesced in the late 19th century, early 20th century. The two coalesced very clearly into the 20th century and beyond. And let's not forget that a huge element of scientific racism is this view that the people on the receiving end of genocide, in this case Gazans, but of course many other groups throughout history, that they are somehow dirtier than the rest of humanity, that they are subhuman, and so on and so on. We're all pretty well versed in it, I think. I don't need to belabor the point, but I think that relationship conceptually and historically between genocide and scientific racism is really important to keep in mind when we're looking at what's playing out in Gaza right now and what has been playing out from the start, not just direct military attacks or military engagement or combat warfare, but these kinds of often genocidal pronouncements which allude to Palestinians as subhuman, and in many cases, in the case of Amalek, for example, invoke biblical language and lexicon to justify it.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen a complete demolition job basically on the hospitals of Gaza. Like I say, most of the building's been taken out too. But I think when you're particularly targeting health infrastructure, it doesn't seem to me to be a big jump to actually start targeting critically important municipal infrastructure too, water, waste disposal, and so on. A Jewish American man is accused of the attempted murder of 2 Israeli tourists he reportedly mistook for Palestinians. A surveillance video appeared to show 27-year-old Mordechai Brafman exiting his truck and opening fire at a passing vehicle. At the request of his lawyer, Brafman was not interviewed by police, but while in custody, he spontaneously stated, quote, "While driving my truck, I saw 2 Palestinians and shot and killed both." In actual fact, both men survived. One suffered a gunshot wound to the shoulder, and the other was only grazed on his forearm. In a grimly ironic twist, however, shortly after the attack, one of the victims took to social media to post virulent anti-Arab racism. Here's a screenshot of that now deleted Facebook post. "My father and I went through a murder attempt against anti-Semitic background. They tried to murder us in the heart of Miami. But the creator of the world is with us, so he didn't go. I want to say thank you to everyone for their support, and it is not taken for granted. With Israel live, or long live Israel. Death to the Arabs." Ironically enough, the guy shooting him also thought the same. Since the beginning of Israel's war on Gaza, there have been several violent attacks on Palestinians in the US. On the 14th of October 2023, 6-year-old Palestinian-American boy Wadia Al-Fayoum was stabbed 26 times by the landlord who owned his family's Chicago apartment. His mother was also stabbed several times but survived the attack. Prosecutors said the 71-year-old killer landlord was obsessed with the war on Gaza. What an appalling attack. In November 2023, meanwhile, 3 Palestinian-American students were shot in Vermont, leaving one of them, 20-year-old Hisham Awatini, paralyzed from the neck down. The victims were reportedly wearing keffiyehs and speaking Arabic at the time of the attack. Campaigners have questioned why many politicians who've been so vocal about the threat of anti-Semitism in the US have simultaneously failed to condemn anti-Palestinian racism, including a child being stabbed 26 times. Kieran, bringing things back to Miami, this story is like something out of a comedy sketch, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, Larry David is probably sitting somewhere quietly fighting back laughter. There's more than a touch of the Palestinian chicken episode of Curb Your Enthusiasm in some of this. But I hope that doesn't sound too glib, because it is there's a very, very serious point around all of this, of course, which is that, well, several serious points. First of all, Zionism, if anybody needed any more proof, is an extremely depraved, messianic, racist death cult. And, Zionist ideology is ever committed to, certainly at this juncture in history, the extermination of Palestinians. And that, of course, racism is indiscriminate as well as being discriminate. So it's foolish. And in this case, it means that an individual has shot people on his own side because of pigment levels in their skin and perceived assumptions about their appearances. But yeah, that's obviously a very serious point. And the other serious point is that there is a rise in anti-Arab racism in the United States. You went over some of the examples, Aaron, a moment ago. Actually, there are some serious, I think pretty seriously disturbing hate groups, one of which is a group called Beta, that is going around university campuses in the United States day after day after day, intimidating Arabs on university campuses from New York to the Midwest. And, it's the kind of thing that doesn't really get reported by the mainstream media. It doesn't get picked up in the same way that comparative anti-Semitic attacks or threats do get picked up. I think it's very important to mention it. The hypocrisy or the double standards between not just the reporting, but actually the policing of these things is disturbing. And I think, I hope not, but I suspect these are straws in the wind, because Palestinians, particularly over the past 18 months, have been demeaned in public, have been dehumanized so systematically through the media that, in some quarters, in some racist quarters, again, high on the racist ideology of Zionism, I think I fear that it's open season.
Yeah, I mean, I asked you if it was like something from a sketch. You said Larry David. I mean, it does feel like a joke, right? What do you call it when a Zionist, ultra-nationalist Israeli shoots another Zionist, ultra-nationalist anti-Semitism? I mean, what else could it be, right? But this is just the most egregious example, which has found its way through to the global Anglophone sort of news media environment because it's so ludicrous. But this mindset is responsible for so much suffering and hate and physical violence, not just in Gaza. As I said, those stories, I mean, there's been so much happening, obviously in Gaza, the West Bank, that you easily forget some of these other things. But that story from October 2023 is just remarkable. A landlord stabbed a child who was the child of one of his tenants 26 times. I mean, I can't conceive of anything more evil. I cannot conceive of anything more evil. We're told constantly by the media what to feel about this or that story. I say this all the time, right? The media long ago gave up on the idea of informing you about story or even telling you what to think about stories. They now tell you what to feel. So it's not what to think, but what to feel. It's another level up. But this in particular, I mean, it's just one of those that's been jettisoned from popular consciousness. That story and this one, I think, really underscore the violence and the contempt held towards Arabs in general, but I think Gazans and Palestinians in particular. Really, really extraordinary. Ever heard of TED? TED Talks? It's less of a thing now, but a decade ago, it was the place to be if you wanted to make an argument, launch a book, get people talking about that one thing you care about most. Ideas worth spreading, as the line went. For those who aren't aware of what it is, TED is an annual get-together in Vancouver, Canada. And it's there that the likes of Bill Gates and Elon Musk, and even yours truly, give talks. Now, imagine TED, but in London, and very right-wing. I mean, really, really right-wing. That's essentially what ARC is, another three-letter annual conference. ARC stands for Alliance for Responsible Citizenship. ARC's 2025 conference started yesterday and will continue through to tomorrow, so 17th to 19th of February. I'm afraid tickets are sold out for this year. This now regular jamboree of the great and the good of conservatism was started by this guy, Paul Marshall. Mr. Marshall is very rich and very generous with his cash. He's worth approximately £650 million, and in 2024, he topped the Sunday Times giving list, having donated £145.1 million over 12 months to various charities. He's also increasingly involved in politics and the media. He owns website Unheard, is a joint owner of GB News. Meanwhile, last September, he bought The Spectator magazine for £100 million. He also funds an entire department at the London School of Economics. Is this man Britain's most successful Gramscian? Gramsci, if you're not aware of who that is, was a communist theoretician who sought to change politics and political reality through creating new cultural institutions, counter-hegemony, as he called it. In any case, to get a sense of the scale and slickness of ARC as an event, not to mention its politics, have a look at this post by Elizabeth Heverin on X. I'm at ARC. Every time Judeo-Christian values is mentioned, I will take a shot. That, as you can see, is an image of those there. Approximately 4,000 people at the Excel Centre, although I should say, there's more than a few empty chairs in front of Elizabeth there. Her next tweet, 1 hour later, you died from Minecraft. Obviously, lots of people talk about Judeo-Christian values at these places. The list of those appearing at ARC this year is very long and in some places quite impressive. Guests and attendees include the US Secretary of State for Energy, Michael Gove, Barry Weiss, Jordan Peterson, Douglas Murray, Niall Ferguson, Nigel Farage, Kemi Badenoch, former Australian PM Tony Abbott, Vivek Ramaswamy, Dave Rubin, Eric Prince, Zia Yusuf. To get a real flavour of the event's vibe and objectives, here's a clip from a speech given by Douglas Murray yesterday.
One of the questions, I think, that all ages ask themselves is, what do they call the age that they are in? Almost every age has had this question. Most recently, the age of modernism asked what comes after modernism, and the rather unoriginal idea was postmodernism. Postmodernism, of course, included its offspring of deconstructionism, and nothing came from that. But I would like to suggest a name for the age that we should be in and the age that this conference can help bring in, the age of reconstruction. We should be the reconstructionists. The deconstructionists knew something about how to take things apart, but like children with bicycles, had no idea how to put them back together. So it'll be the job of people like those in this room to try to put that civilization back together. And I'm delighted that that's one of the things that we're gathered here to do.
And here's another clip from another speaker, Jordan Peterson.
So what is the defining characteristic of this civilizational moment? I would say that what lies in front of us, perhaps for the first time, is the opportunity to make the foundational principles of our civilization conscious, explicit, and propositional. And in so doing, to pave the way for a genuine and mutually appreciative union of traditional conservatism and classic liberalism.
Conservatism and liberalism, they're two different isms for a reason. They're different ideologies. Anyway, this is something you hear about a lot, right? I'm a classical liberal, that's why I'm also a conservative. Liberalism is a revolutionary ideology in the context of conservative values. Anyway, we'll return to that in a moment. In a similar vein, another speaker, Ayan Hurst Ali, said this: "My message here to you today is to stress that responsible citizenship in the West is inseparable from Christian morality." Ayan at ARC 2025 today. One of the highlights of the event was author and philosopher king Jordan Peterson in conversation with Nigel Farage. Our view is if we're going to use fossil fuels, we may as well produce them ourselves and genuinely be energy independent. And our platform is to reindustrialize Britain. It's crazy, by the way, that Farage is saying that. Anyway, a big conversation between Nigel Farage and Jordan Peterson at ARC 2025. That, again, is from the ARC_Forum X account. That is wild. Farage is talking about reindustrialization. This is the same man during the Liz Truss premiership who said that her budget was the best budget since 1987. And now he's talking about reindustrialization. Talk about being a political chameleon. Kieran, I found that last week really interesting. And I found the presence of Farage and also Zia Yusuf, the Reform chair at ARC, really interesting. Because at the very same time that Reform is leading with YouGov for the third week in a row, Nigel Farage is on stage talking about ideas with the world's most successful conservative author. What do you make of that?
I mean, first of all, it's Comic-Con for the international far right. And though many conferences of that sort have been organised throughout history, I think what's different about this is the amount of money behind it and the production values and the, let's say, the comprehensiveness of it, the number, the extent of the people that are there. What do I think about it? It makes me envious, if I'm honest. It makes me very envious. Not because I want to be there with those nutters and headbangers, but because it's what the left should be doing. It's like we're watching a sort of obscene, perverse sliding doors, parallel, a counterfactual history playing out in front of us of what we ought to be doing. I mean, the renationalization point that you made, Aaron, is the perfect one to illustrate what I'm saying. These are left ideas. We've had our pockets picked over and over and over again. And it's these guys who are organized in a hall, mad as a box of frogs, nonetheless coherent, very ruthless as strategists, effective, and with loads and loads of dosh behind them. Now, obviously, the dosh behind them thing, that's an inherent handicap that we have on the left. It makes much more sense for very rich people to pump money into, a set of ideologies that are fundamentally not threatening to or inimical to the reproduction of capitalist accumulation. But nonetheless, I'm sure that there is much that we ought to be doing differently on the left. I mean, the Gramsci point as well is a good one. If, somewhat storied, it is a good point. This is institutional capacity building. And that's what the international right and far right are finding themselves more and more able to do. They're having a moment. They're in vogue. I mean, we've said this multiple times when we talk about reform. They are having a moment. And I think it's the left's obligation to ensure that it remains a moment only. But with this kind of level of organization, production values, money behind it, internal ideological coherence, etc., etc., I'm very, very concerned. And actually, that's the final point is, the left struggles with these things partly because we care about the differences between us. And that's not always a bad thing. It makes our discourse more rigorous and so on. But we need to try and find, I think, the sweet spot between constantly refining our discourse on the left and getting real about the extremely hostile institutional, structural, etc., economic environment that we find ourselves in if we're ever going to be able to act as a counterweight to this kind of thing.
Yeah, it is really fascinating that if you look at the political terrain today in the UK, people like Paul Marshall, people like Nigel Farage, it does feel like they're the inheritors of Leninism and Gramsci. Like it really, really does. And I do feel that with Marshall, this particular emphasis and focus on cultural institution building, I mean, the guy's read Gramsci, right? It does feel like that. And some people have said, well, no, the right's been interested in ideas and winning hearts and minds for a long time. Absolutely true. But the guy's not wasting money on the Conservative Party. He's donated money before to the Conservative Party, but he's spending tens of millions, 100 million actually in the case of The Spectator, on culture and media. I mean, there's some stuff he's doing, which I didn't mention, by the way, in the story earlier on. He's paying for the training of vast numbers of priests in the Church of England. This is the sort of thing that Graham should be like, that's how you do it. That is how you do it, because the politics is downstream from the culture. So you have to shift that first. And I think you're right, Kieran. The left had that truism of, unity is strength. Sometimes we forget that, right? And then you see these guys. By the way, they disagree about a lot. Many people at that event today will be neo-reactionaries. They genuinely think that the American Revolution was a mistake. That's how reactionary they are. And then you have somebody like Jordan Peterson saying, I'm actually a classical liberal. There'll also be people who are just very confused. And not for the first time, Rachel Reeves has been accused of being a tiny bit flexible with the truth. It's actually getting hard to keep up with the Chancellor's alleged deceptions. And the most recent example is so petty it is almost more damning, because it makes you wonder whether anything she says can be trusted. Here's a quote from the newspaper The Daily Express. The Chancellor's Who's Who entry claimed she was previously a contributor to the Journal of Political Economy, a prestigious and highly selective journal featuring only the best quality academic articles. It's now been revealed she in fact wrote for the European Journal of Political Economy, a difference described as akin to that between Oxford University and the former Polytechnic Oxford Brookes. Bit of classism there. The entry also repeats her now disproven claim to have worked at the Bank of England until 2009, when she actually left in 2006 after just 5.5 years. Who's Who is the UK's most prominent directory of prominent figures, having been published since 1849 and includes more than 33,000 biographies. Since 1897, entries have been compiled from questionnaires filled in by their subjects, which the founders claimed leads to improved accuracy. Therefore, the inaccuracy in Miss Reeves' entry suggests she was once again responsible for an embellishment. They do seem to have caught her red-handed here. As the piece mentions, Reeves' time at the Bank of England is one point of major contention. The Sunday Times dug up an interview she gave to the Stylist magazine in 2021, that of course is the magazine of the Sunday Times, where she said the following. I spent a decade working as an economist at the Bank of England and loved it. So I was excited to be given the opportunity to help shape our country's economic future. However, according to her LinkedIn, Rachel Reeves only worked at the Bank of England for 5.5 years. 5.5, 10, quite a big difference. And it was subsequently pointed out that for one of those years, she was studying at the London School of Economics. There's also her role at HBOS, the merged Halifax and Bank of Scotland. According to Reeves' LinkedIn, she worked there as an economist. But right-wing blog Guido Fawkes accused her of exaggerating her role in, quote, a mundane support department. That was based on the testimony of former colleagues. It was confirmed that Rachel Reeves actually worked in a managerial role in the complaints handling department, and on her LinkedIn, the economist job title was replaced with retail banking. A former colleague also alleged that in 2009, Reeves was almost sacked by HBOS over an expenses scandal. A BBC investigation found there was an expenses investigation into Reeves and 2 other senior managers. Here's a quote from that piece. We have learned that there was an expenses investigation into Reeves and 2 other senior managers. A detailed 6-page whistleblowing complaint and dozens of pages of attached evidence, which we have seen, raised concerns that the 3 managers were using the bank's money to, quote, fund a lifestyle, with allegedly inappropriate spending on dinners, events, taxis and gifts, including for each other. We have not been able to establish what the final outcome of the investigation was. Indeed, it may not have concluded. But the initial part of the investigation, which was conducted by internal audit at the request of the bank's risk department, found that the 3 managers appeared to have broken the rules and the whistleblower's allegations were substantiated, according to a senior source with knowledge of the investigation. Also, if you look at the dates, I think that's around March, April. I believe Reeves leaves in May. Important to say, Rachel Reeves claims to have taken a sort of redundancy package. And of course, in 2009, in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, HBOS was in deep trouble. But you can see why, if you're being unsympathetic. That kind of looks bad. Anyway, there was also the controversy over Rachel Reeves' book. The Financial Times found more than 20 examples of plagiarism in The Women Who Made Modern Economics. Entire passages were either directly copied and pasted or reworked with only minor changes, with no acknowledgement of the original source. Reeves admitted she'd made mistakes, but played down the scale of the wrongdoing. Here's what she told the BBC at the time. It is true that there were some sentences in the book that were not properly referenced in the bibliography. I'm the author of that book. I hold my hands up and say, I should have done better. Now, I don't know about you, but I'd find it easier to stomach the fact our Chancellor is basically a blagger if she'd spent less time lecturing the rest of us on our work ethic. I see headlines like this. Unemployed young people must step up, Chancellor says. And I think, well, it is probably much easier to find a job if you just make things up on your CV. Sure, I'll step up if I can double the amount of time I worked here or create whole new publications, which I never actually did. Kieran, what do you think? Am I being unfair? With Rachel Reeves, there's two things that really come to mind. The first is that some of this stuff is so obscure that to not tell the whole truth about it would indicate that it's quite widespread. And at the same time, I know lots of people lie on CVs, lots of people misrepresent their skills. Her LinkedIn was still saying this stuff when she was literally the Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Bob Dylan claimed he was a trained circus performer when he first started out. But then again, Bob Dylan wrote Blowing in the Wind at the age of 21. Probity is important, but so also is brilliance. And I think the main problem for the Chancellor is that she seems to possess neither. And, quite aside from all of that, it is, we're talking about Chancellor of the Exchequer. It's the second most important role in government in this country after the Prime Minister. And she is part of a government that, as you alluded to, Aaron, is through Liz Kendall and the current DWP and so on, waging a kind of culture war against so-called scroungers. And of course, that isn't exactly what we're discussing here, but it's related. It's tangentially related to it or adjacent to it. And so I think that those factors combined, we were talking about this earlier, several of us, as to whether it was really that egregious. I think it is precisely for those reasons that we're not only talking about the Chancellor of the Exchequer, we're not only talking about a government that is extremely right-wing and wants to clamp down on, people who allegedly are scrounging, though there is zero data to support that view. We're also talking about a Chancellor who just can't seem to deliver anything and a government that just can't seem to deliver anything. All of those things dovetailed or wrapped up together make it quite a significant story that she seems to be a habitual and repetitive liar. I think, I don't want to see a government comprised of people who went to elite schools, people who have worked at the most elite and prestigious organizations in the world. And in Rachel Reeves, somehow we seem to find something even worse, which is somebody who lies about their elite credentials without having put in any of the prerequisite work. And I think what we need is, broadly speaking, there's a serious point here about the supply of politicians into British political life and into government. We talked about it last week, Aaron, as well, that there is a serious problem with the quality of politician that this country seems to be producing. Again, I'm very aware of the limitations on that argument. I'm very aware that every generation hates its politicians. You could go back all the way to the 18th, 17th century and find caricaturists lampooning the politicians of the day, saying that this is the most inept bunch that's ever been elected or not elected, if you go back far enough. However, there is a marked decline. I think everybody broadly agrees there's a marked decline over the past 10, 15 years, certainly, in the quality of candidate that is making it into Parliament. We need to think very seriously about how we draw people up from a broad cross-section of society, but do it in a way that is is genuinely meritocratic and isn't just based on connections or, in this case, lying on your CV or good old-fashioned elitism.
Yeah, what makes this really interesting for me is that with the Labour right, the modus operandi is credentialism, right? That you have the credentials. They only listen to people who, are CEOs of FTSE 100 company if you're going to have an opinion on the economy or business. Forget being somebody who's a small business person with 20 staff. I don't care about you. I care about the FTSE CEO. They care about status and credentialism. And I find it really strange that as a result of that blind faith in credentialism, you then get Rachel Reeves. Is it Rachel Reeves? Somebody who said they're an economist, but actually what were they doing again? I don't know. What were they doing? Business continuity or something? I don't know. Something tangentially related, operational in a bank, but they weren't actually working as an economist. They're trained as an economist. Anyway. So how does she end there? And I think you're right, Kieran, to talk about primaries. I do look at people like Rachel Reeves, and I think, what kind of political system do you have to have for this person to have ended up where she is? What kind of political system elevates this person to where they are? I look at Donald Trump with the primary system in the US, the presidential system, it makes total sense. You have a system like that, you're obviously going to reward celebrity, you're going to reward outsiders, and actually having a long-term party machine is less important. I get it. Then I look at Rachel Reeves, it's kind of like the converse. What kind of system creates Rachel Reeves as Chancellor? One which rewards loyalty and being obsequious above genuine talent. One which effectively promotes party insiders and apparatchiks. One which doesn't really care about people with original thinking, but rewards people who just say the thing that you're meant to say. You're going through the motions. A system which basically serves people who are already quite powerful in quite mundane ways. So you've got primaries, which, by the way, can create very, very bad results, but it does allow outsiders to change the rules of the game, as we saw with Bernie Sanders, as we see with Trump, as we saw with AOC at the micro level, right? And then I see our system. We have first past the post without primaries. I think we've got the worst of both. I think it just leads to a completely dead political class. And what you can say in response to that is, well, Aaron, primaries reward populism and people can be against things but never for them. Totally buy that. The problem now with our system is that all of that energy is going towards reform. And because of first past the post but no primaries, they can, I think to some extent correctly, point to the entirety of the political class and claim it's illegitimate and unrepresentative, which, by the way, it is. I think that's a major problem. I do think that's a major problem. And I do wonder what it says about us as a country that even our supposedly intelligent centrist commentariat can't see what's coming. Kieran, any final thoughts on Reeves and what do we need to do? Give me one thing, Kieran, one thing that doesn't cost anything, which would improve the caliber of politicians in this country.
Well, I think it's very true that the political system doesn't exist in a vacuum. That's an insipid thing to say, but I'll explain what I mean. I think the reason we got a very high caliber of candidate in politics for a very long time, in the middle of the 20th century at least, into the later parts of the 20th century as well, actually, is because of the unions. I think that the unions acted as a brilliant trading wheel for many of the finest minds on the left and many of the best fighters on the left in Parliament. And obviously, if it follows that if the power and the prevalence of union politics dies away, then that avenue of supply, that conveyor belt from unions into the formal political system is going to fall away. So I suppose what I'm really saying is that if you want to see a shift in the quality of the political class, then you need to shift things outside of politics, because part of the problem is people are going on a different kind of conveyor belt from Oxbridge straight into Westminster, working as interns, then working as spads, then becoming politicians. And I don't want to sound like some version of the Daily Mail 10 years ago, but they don't have any real world experience. And that's not universally true, don't get me wrong, but it is true of an increasing number of parliamentarians and certainly an increasing number of Labour parliamentarians. So I think, I've just set the little task of reconfiguring the structural apparatus outside of the Labour Party and presiding over a resurgence in the union and the power of unions in this country if we want to see an improvement in the quality of candidate. But short of that, Aaron, I think your idea for primaries is a good one. And I would love to see an entirely different electoral system in this country as well. So I think we should organise on that basis as well.
Yeah, it wasn't that long ago we had really talented politicians. You look at Nye Bevan. I think at one point was a literal coal miner. This is the man who helped found the NHS. Ernest Bevan, not my politics, but he was the Secretary of State for Defence when Britain got a nuclear weapon. He was a driver before entering politics. He was a driver. I think he was a hod carrier as well at one point. Barbara Castle, you could go on and on and on and on. Immensely talented people who managed to get a foot international politics, like you say, Kieran, through the Labour movement. Compare those people today. A guy was a hod carrier, and then he's overseeing the foreign policy, defence policy of one of the world's great powers. A person was a miner, and then he's starting the NHS. We've fallen a really, really long way. And I think part of that is because we think that credentialed, professional, managerial class people have all the answers, they know everything. Actually, they're responsible for most of the things which have gone wrong over the last half a century. We keep on underperforming because we think these guys have all the answers. And it's something I think, actually, sadly, the right populists get, that the left populists haven't really been, myself included, by the way, willing to accept. That was an analysis which we should have just held on to a long time ago. The answers will not come from the credentialed professional managerial class. And tying yourselves to them as part of your political coalition will only sink you. Look what just happened to the Democrats. What a wonderful show. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Come back tomorrow for another live show at 6 p.m. Until then, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.